I never imagined the day would come when I would stand on the ridge above my lake, staring down at 79 vacation cabins that had sprung up like weeds, built not by chance but by the greed of an HOA that thought they could steal what was mine and turn it into their playground, their business, their empire. And as I watched the construction crews hammering, the lights flickering in the night, and the sound of chainsaws echoing across the water, I knew I had been pushed past the point of patience. Because this wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about the theft of my peace, my sanctuary, my heritage. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought their contracts, their permits, their smug little meetings would protect them. But what they didn't understand was that the land, the water, and the dam that controlled it all belonged to me. And when you push a man off his land and spit on his rights, you don't just provoke anger, you unleash something unstoppable. I could still remember the day my grandfather handed me the keys to the dam control, his weathered hands trembling as he told me, "This lake is your bloodline, son. Guard it with everything you have." And that memory burned inside me as I watched Karen, the HOA president, parading around the shoreline in her designer sunglasses, boasting about the cabins that would fund the future of the community when in reality, all she cared about was lining her pockets and cementing her power. People often wonder how ordinary men find the courage to stand against entire systems, against corruption and arrogance that seems too big to fight. But the truth is, the courage comes not from wanting to fight, but from having no other choice. Because when they come for everything you love, you either surrender or you strike back. And I wasn't raised to surrender. This story isn't just about cabins on a lake. It's about betrayal, greed, and justice delivered in a way they never saw coming. And if you think HOAs are untouchable, if you think power and money always win, stay with me. Because by the time I'm done telling you what happened, you'll see how one man turned their empire into ruins overnight. They bulldozed my land. They disrespected my family. They ignored every warning, and in their arrogance, they forgot one thing. The water they were building on was mine to control. And the dam they overlooked would become the weapon that ended their dreams. I filmed every step, documented every lie, and when I finally pulled that lever and let the lake roar back into its natural state, those 79 cabins stood no chance, and neither did the people who thought they could outsmart me. This isn't just revenge, it's a lesson, a reckoning. It's a warning to anyone who believes they can abuse power without consequence. So sit back, subscribe to Sham Stories, and follow me through every twist of this battle, because by the end, you'll understand why the HOA never should have crossed me, why their empire of cabins washed away in the blink of an eye, and why justice, when delivered by the hands of a man defending his own, is as unstoppable as the flood I unleashed that night. The weeks that followed became a battlefield of words, papers, and appearances, each side scrambling to seize control of the narrative. And while Karen fought with her usual venom, filing lawsuits, calling in state regulators, and standing in front of cameras to paint herself as the victim of my reckless violence, I moved quietly but deliberately, meeting with lawyers who knew the history of property law better than any politician, digging through archives that proved beyond doubt the ownership of the dam, and gathering testimony from neighbors who had suffered under the HOA's chokehold long before this disaster struck. Each day seemed to bring another headline, another argument on the evening news. And though Karen tried to dominate the conversation, her cracks showed more with every passing week. Because every reporter who dug deeper into the HOA's practices uncovered more filth fines issued without cause, permits obtained through questionable means, intimidation tactics used against homeowners who resisted her control, and a trail of greed so thick it was impossible to ignore. Public sentiment began shifting, slowly at first, then like a landslide. And I could feel the tide turning in my favor, though Karen's fury only grew stronger. She stood outside the courthouse during hearings, screaming into microphones, her carefully curated image slipping as frustration twisted her features. While I walked past silently, letting the mountain of evidence speak louder than I ever could. Inside the courtroom, her lawyers argued passionately that I had destroyed millions in property value, that I had endangered lives, that I was reckless and malicious. But my counsel countered with deeds, records, and contracts signed decades before the HOA even existed. Documents that made it clear the lake and dam were under my stewardship, not hers, and that the cabins had been constructed illegally on stolen land. It was in those hearings that I saw the first glimmers of doubt in the judge's eyes. A recognition that Karen's empire was not only fragile, but rotten at its core. And though the final ruling had not yet come, I walked out of the courthouse one evening and knew in my gut that justice was bending my way. Yet Karen did not relent. She doubled down, rallying the remaining loyalists in the HOA, storming into neighborhood meetings with fire in her voice, promising to rebuild. To put me in prison where I belong, her words sharp but increasingly hollow, because her supporters dwindled with each new revelation. Some of the investors who had lost cabins banded together, attempting to sue me directly. But their case fell apart the moment they realized Karen had never secured legitimate rights to sell them land in the first place. And instead of bleeding me dry, they turned their anger on her, demanding refunds, demanding accountability, and leaving her more isolated than ever. I watched from a distance, never gloating, never shouting, but always steady, because I knew patience was my greatest weapon now. Let her scream. Let her burn herself out in front of cameras, because the truth would crush her louder than my voice ever could. At night, I returned to the dam, my sanctuary, the key still heavy in my pocket, and I felt an odd sense of peace as I listened to the water running freely once again. No cabins cluttering the shoreline, no music or laughter taunting me from across the valley, just the lake as it was meant to be, reflecting the stars and whispering with the wind. Sometimes I wondered if I had gone too far, if unleashing the flood had been too great a punishment, but then I remembered the arrogance, the trespass, the threats, and the way Karen had stood on that dock, proclaiming her dominion over what was never hers, and my doubts dissolved, replaced by the quiet certainty that I had done what had to be done. Still, the fight was not over. The state launched investigations. Committees were formed, hearings dragged on, and Karen did everything in her power to prolong the war, filing appeal after appeal, her claws digging into the system as if she could stop the inevitable fall with sheer willpower. But the weight of truth was too much even for her. Slowly, her allies abandoned her, whispers of mismanagement and corruption circling through town halls and state offices, until even those who had once propped her up began to distance themselves, leaving her standing increasingly alone, a figure of fury consumed by the fire she had stoked herself. For me, the days became strangely lighter, as though each document filed, each lie exposed, lifted a stone from my shoulders, and though I remained vigilant, preparing for whatever tricks she had left, I began to taste the sweetness of victory on the air. A victory not just for myself, but for every person who had ever been crushed by her greed. One evening, as I walked the ridge above the lake, I saw Karen's car parked near the ruins of what had once been the cabins, her figure standing still on the muddy bank, staring out at the water as if searching for some way to bring it all back. And for a moment I felt something unexpected. Not pity, not forgiveness, but a kind of finality, as though the war between us had already been decided, and all that remained was for the world to catch up. She turned then, her eyes locking onto mine across the distance. Her face twisted, not with triumph or even hatred, but something closer to despair. And in that gaze I saw the truth she would never admit aloud. She had lost utterly and completely, and she knew it. I turned away, leaving her to her ghosts, and walked home with a lighter step. Because though battles are won in courtrooms and on paper, the true war had ended the night I opened the dam, and nothing she did could ever change that. The flood raged on long after the first cabins collapsed, tearing through the valley with a force so raw it was almost beautiful, and I stood on the dam, watching it all unfold like some terrible symphony, each crack of timber and crash of glass a note in a song of justice. The screams and shouts of those who had feasted on greed now swallowed by the roar of water reclaiming its place. And as the hours passed, the sun began to sink, painting the wreckage in bruised shades of red and gold. The once pristine cabins reduced to floating debris scattered across the widening current. I should have felt guilty, maybe even horrified, but instead I felt a strange calm, sense of inevitability, because deep down I knew this was the only way it could have ended. Karen had pushed too hard. The HOA had flown too close to the sun, and in their arrogance they had forgotten that every action has a consequence. And some debts cannot be escaped no matter how many contracts or bylaws you hide behind. From the hillside, I could see the survivors huddling together, wet, shivering, stripped of their smugness. No longer investors or property owners, but frightened people who had been reminded of their fragility. And though part of me wanted to turn away, another part couldn't stop staring. Because in their ruined faces, I saw not only fear, but a dawning realization that they had been wrong. That their empire had been built on sand. And that the man they had mocked and threatened now stood above them as the only one left with power. Karen herself was still there, pacing furiously at the edge of the wreckage, her voice raw from screaming. Her eyes wild as she pointed at me again and again, shouting words I couldn't make out but knew were filled with blame and venom. Yet there was nothing she could do. No phone call, no lawyer, number sheriff that could reverse what had already been unleashed. And the futility of her rage was almost poetic. By nightfall, the cabins were gone, the valley filled with nothing but swirling water and broken remnants. And I walked back across the dam to my home, exhausted but resolute, knowing the hardest part was yet to come, because destruction, while swift, is never the end. It is the reckoning that follows that truly defines whether a man has acted with justice or simply vengeance. I barely slept that night, the sound of the rushing water filling the air like an endless reminder of what I had done. And though I knew I would not regret it, I also knew Karen would not let this go, that the HOA would rally, that they would paint me as a criminal, a madman, a saboteur who had destroyed their dreams out of spite, and I prepared myself for the storm of retribution that was surely on its way. Morning came with helicopters circling overhead, news crews scrambling onto the roads, reporters speaking into cameras about the catastrophic dam release and the total destruction of 79 luxury cabins, and though they spoke with the urgency of disaster, I could hear the undercurrent of fascination in their voices, because deep down, they knew this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a story, the kind of story that would capture the attention of the state and maybe even the nation, a story of greed meeting its match. And already people were starting to ask the question that Karen dreaded most: who gave the HOA the right to build those cabins in the first place? As I watched the chaos unfold on my old television, sipping coffee with steady hands, I realized that the narrative was not as one-sided as Karen hoped. The reporters weren't just pointing fingers at me. They were digging into permits, questioning legality, interviewing old residents who told tales of intimidation, threats, and the ruthless tactics the HOA had used to seize the lake. And for the first time, I saw Karen cornered, forced to answer questions she had long silenced with money and influence. But she didn't go quietly. Within hours, the sheriff's department arrived at my door. A pair of deputies grim-faced as they informed me that I was under investigation for criminal negligence and destruction of property. Their words heavy, but their eyes betraying something else. A flicker of unease because they knew who really owned the dam. They knew the history of the lake, and though they followed their orders, I could see they weren't sure which side of the law they truly stood on. They didn't arrest me outright, instead serving papers, warning me to prepare for a hearing, and as they drove off, I felt the weight of the battle ahead settling on my shoulders, but it did not crush me. If anything, it lit a fire, because I had spent my whole life preparing for moments when men in suits and badges would try to strip me of what was rightfully mine. And I had no intention of backing down now. Karen, of course, went on the offensive, appearing on every news station she could, sobbing into cameras about how I had ruined the dreams of hardworking families and committed an act of domestic terrorism, her words dramatic enough to draw sympathy from some. But to anyone who had lived under her rule, it was laughable. And as clips of her screeching played on repeat, more and more people began to share their own stories, tales of unfair fines, unlawful threats, and the crushing arrogance of the HOA that had destroyed lives long before I ever touched the dam. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and though I knew I still faced trials and hearings and lawyers eager to bleed me dry, I also knew I had the one thing Karen could never buy, the truth, and the truth was on my side. In the days that followed, the wreckage was combed through. Insurance companies declared it all a total loss, and the investors who had once cheered Karen now began to distance themselves, their loyalty evaporating as quickly as the water levels that receded back to the dam's natural flow. And though Karen raged louder than ever, I could see the cracks in her empire widening. At night, I would stand on the dam again, listening to the quiet, the kind of quiet I had missed for months. And though I knew the fight was far from over, I also knew I had dealt a blow they would never forget. A blow that would haunt Karen every time she tried to rebuild, every time she tried to assert her control, because deep down she would always remember the night. She lost everything to the man she thought she could bully into submission. The following week unfolded with a strange kind of tension in the air. The kind you can almost taste, heavy and electric like the moments before a storm. And though everyone else in the valley seemed caught up in Karen's pageantry of ribbon cuttings and photo ops, I kept my eyes fixed on the dam and the ticking clock in my mind that counted down to the moment when everything they had built would return to the mud it had been stolen from. Because I knew nature has a way of reclaiming what arrogance tries to take, and all I had to do was open the gate. Karen strutted along the shoreline daily, leading tours for potential buyers, bragging about the exclusive cabins and how they represented the future of our community. Her words dripping with the kind of manufactured optimism only salespeople and con artists could muster. And it made my stomach churn to hear her spin the destruction of the lake into some kind of triumph. But while she preached about property values and economic growth, I walked the shadows, checking the spillways again and again, making sure every lever, every chain, every rusty hinge on the dam would move when I needed it to. Because when the time came, there could be no mistakes, no delays. Only the clean and unrelenting force of water unleashed in its purest form. At night, the cabins glowed with warm lights as the workers celebrated their finished labor. Music carrying across the water, beer bottles clinking, and laughter echoing like a challenge thrown into the darkness. And I would stand on my porch with the key to the dam clutched in my hand, whispering to myself that soon those lights would be snuffed out, and that the valley would fall silent once again, as it was meant to be. Some of my neighbors, those who still had a shred of loyalty to the history of the lake, began approaching me in hushed tones, asking if I had a plan, if I would allow Karen to win. And though I never told them outright what I was preparing, I saw the flicker of hope in their eyes when I simply said, trust me, they wanted to believe in something, in someone willing to stand against the machine that had bulldozed through their lives. And though they couldn't admit it aloud, I knew they were silently rooting for me to do the unthinkable, to strike the blow they all wished they had the courage to attempt. Meanwhile, Karen pushed harder, sending more letters, more threats, now claiming that the HOA had voted to restrict my access to the lake entirely until I resolved my outstanding obligations, as if the very water belonged to her. And it was in that moment, standing on the dock holding her notice, that I realized the game was over. That her greed had left her blind to the fact she was poking a bear that would not tolerate one more provocation. The night before I chose to act, I walked the length of the dam one final time. The air crisp and sharp, the moon high and silver on the water, casting long shadows across the cabins that clustered like parasites on the shoreline, and I breathed deep, savoring the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, those shadows would be gone, replaced by wreckage and mud, their owners scattering like ants as their little empire crumbled. I thought of my grandfather, of the sweat and pain he had poured into building the dam. Not for profit or prestige, but for survival and stewardship, and I felt his presence in that moment, as though his calloused hands rested on mine, urging me forward, reminding me that some legacies are defended not with words, but with action. The morning dawned deceptively beautiful, sunlight glinting off the lake, birds cutting across the surface in lazy arcs, the cabins gleaming with fresh wood and new paint, and I could hear voices carrying from the other side as Karen gathered her investors for another round of celebrations. Champagne glasses already being filled before noon, their laughter carried on the wind like a taunt. And I smiled because, I knew laughter has a way of curdling into screams when arrogance meets reality. I waited until mid-afternoon, when the crowd was at its peak, when every cabin seemed occupied, when Karen herself stood proudly on the pier raising a toast to their bright future, and I made my way to the dam. The key heavy and solid in my palm, the stone beneath my boots as familiar as my own skin. The crank sat there, old and iron and waiting, and as I slid the key into the lock, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not even vengeance, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes only when you align with something greater than yourself. When you stop fighting the tide and become the tide. I turned the key. The gears groaned to life, chains rattling. And with a heave of the crank, the first gate opened. And the sound of rushing water filled the valley, low and rumbling at first like distant thunder, before growing into a roar that vibrated through my bones. And I stepped back, watching as the lake surged forward, unleashed, unstoppable, ancient in its fury. The wave built quickly, sweeping across the basin, a wall of white froth and dark water surging toward the cabins, and for a moment I simply stood there, rooted, watching as nature reclaimed her dominion, and I swear I felt the valley exhale. As though relieved to finally shrug off the insult it had been forced to bear. The first cabins went quickly, their stilts buckling as water slammed against them. Walls cracking, glass shattering, and the shrieks of the celebrants pierced the air, sharp and panicked. A perfect counterpoint to the smug laughter that had filled the valley only hours before. And Karen's voice rose above them all, screaming orders, cursing, demanding control in a moment where control was no longer hers to wield. The water tore through the structures like they were made of paper, dragging furniture, beams, and shattered dreams into the torrent. And I could see people scrambling onto the hillside, slipping and falling as the flood consumed everything in its path. From where I stood on the dam, I could see Karen herself drenched and furious, screaming something I couldn't hear over the roar of the water, her perfect hair plastered to her face, her clipboard gone, her empire dissolving before her eyes. And in that instant, I felt no pity, only the satisfaction of justice delivered. Not by me, but by the valley itself. The battle truly began the moment I marched into that HOA meeting, the one they thought I wouldn't dare attend. And the room went silent when I walked through the door, every eye turning toward me as if I were some kind of intruder in a place I had no business being. And yet the irony was, this entire community had sprung up around the lake my family had owned for nearly a century. And without our dam, there would have been no lake at all. No cabins, no homes, nothing but a dry valley. And that truth burned on my tongue as I glared at Karen and her board members sitting at the head of the table with their smug expressions and overpriced coffee cups. They had built an illusion of power, spurring into each other's ears and passing papers back and forth like they were kings and queens instead of petty tyrants. And when I demanded to know who gave them permission to build 79 cabins on my shoreline, Karen leaned back in her chair, smirked, and said, "The community voted. And you're part of this community, so you're bound by our decision." The gall of her words nearly made me laugh, but it also stoked the fire in my chest. Because I wasn't part of their community, I owned the land, the water, the dam, and they were nothing more than squatters, playing pretend with rules they wrote themselves. I laid down the facts, the deeds, the documents proving my rights, but Karen brushed them aside, calling me difficult, uncooperative, and a threat to community. Growth, and the rest of the board nodded like obedient sheep, unwilling to challenge her authority. When I warned them plainly that any cabins built on my lakefront would be destroyed by the waters the moment I chose to open the dam, Karen laughed and called my words empty threats, telling the room that my bluff had already been called because construction crews were days away from completing the first row of cabins, and the rest would soon follow. Her arrogance was so complete, so blinding, that she never once paused to consider that I wasn't bluffing, that I had spent my entire life tending the dam, learning the rhythms of the water, and knowing exactly what would happen if I let nature reclaim what was hers. The meeting dissolved into chaos, as some residents shouted about property values. Others begged me not to make things worse, and still, Karen held her ground, waving her manicured hands in the air like a queen dismissing peasants. Declaring the cabins unstoppable, I walked out of that meeting with my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. And in that moment, I knew there would be no compromise. No negotiation, only war. Over the following weeks, the noise of construction became unbearable, echoing across the lake at dawn and dragging into the night, robbing me of peace in the very place that had once been my sanctuary. Trucks barreled up the mountain road, heavy with lumber and supplies, while Karen strutted along the shoreline with investors, promising them cabins that would bring endless profits and establish her as the savior of the community. Neighbors who once smiled at me now looked away, afraid of choosing sides, but I could see the hesitation in their eyes, quiet recognition that I was being wronged, even if they were too scared to admit it. Every evening I walked to the dam, standing on its old stone platform, feeling the vibrations of the water pressing against its walls, a silent beast waiting to be unleashed. And I knew that when the time came, it would answer my call. Still, I wasn't reckless. I documented every act of the HOA, filmed every cabin going up, saved copies of every letter they sent me demanding compliance fees and threatening legal action. I wanted a record, not because I doubted my course, but because I knew when the flood came, they would try to paint me as the villain, and I needed the truth to stand unshakable. Late at night, I would sit at my kitchen table with papers spread across the surface, drawing maps of the shoreline, marking where each cabin stood, calculating the flow of water and picturing the moment when all of it would vanish beneath the surge. Friends told me to lawyer up, to fight them in court instead of taking matters into my own hands. But I had seen how deep Karen's claws ran, how many county officials were in her pocket, how every legal path had already been blocked. And I realized that waiting for justice through the system would mean waiting until every cabin was complete and my lakefront was unrecognizable. No, the fight wouldn't be won in a courtroom, it would be won in the water. One afternoon, as I was walking the ridge above the construction site, I overheard Karen bragging to a group of investors about the money already flowing in from pre-sold cabins. Her laughter shrill against the wind, and I felt the damn key in my pocket grow heavier, as if it were reminding me that the power wasn't hers, it was mine, and the clock was ticking. By the time the sun set, I had made my decision. They wanted to test me, to see if I would follow through, and I was going to give them their answer in a way they would never forget. The decision weighed heavily on me, but once I'd made it, there was no turning back. And every day that passed only hardened my resolve as the cabins multiplied along the shore like a disease spreading across the body of the lake I had sworn to protect. Each wooden skeleton rising higher, hammer strikes echoing across the valley, and Karen parading around like some conquering queen who thought she had bent nature itself to her will. And though the sight of it burned me, I held my silence. Because vengeance tastes sweeter when served at the moment of maximum arrogance. And I wanted them all to believe I had been broken before I showed them the truth. I spent my nights studying the dam more closely than ever before, tracing the grooves of the old stone, checking the spillways, listening to the deep, endless murmur of water pressing against the gates. And I knew with absolute certainty that when I opened it, the flood would not simply wash away their cabins, it would erase the illusion of power Karen had built, sweeping away the greed that had choked the community like a weed. In the daylight, I played the part of a defeated man, attending their meetings only to sit in silence, letting Karen gloat as she spoke of community progress and shared growth, her voice dripping with condescension as she pointed to charts showing how the cabins would increase property values and turn the lake into a tourist destination. And every nodding head in the room fed her ego while I kept my gaze on her hands, those perfectly manicured nails scratching the surface of papers that meant nothing compared to the key to the dam that never left my pocket. Some of the older residents tried to console me, whispering that things would settle down, that maybe the cabins wouldn't ruin the lake. But I could see the doubt in their faces, the worry etched in their brows. And I knew deep down they were hoping I would do something drastic, something they were too afraid to attempt themselves, and that thought steeled me even more. Then came the day when Karen crossed the line that made patience impossible. She marched onto my property without permission, clipboard in hand, flanked by two men wearing cheap suits and smug grins, and announced that I owed the HOA over $50,000 in community development fees for refusing to participate in their cabin project. And when I laughed in her face, she narrowed her eyes and declared that if I didn't pay, the HOA would pursue foreclosure proceedings against my land. Foreclosure on land that had been in my family for generations. Land that existed only because my grandfather had built the dam with his bare hands, stone by stone, back in a time when survival depended on grit instead of paperwork. And the audacity of her threat nearly drove me to unleash the flood right then and there. But I forced myself to wait, because rage without timing is wasted. And I wanted her arrogance to peak before it crumbled. Over the next week, construction hit its climax. Dozens of cabins standing complete while others were nearly finished, and every time I walked past the dam, I could almost hear the water whispering to me, urging me to let it go, to let the valley remember who truly ruled it. And my nights were haunted by dreams of waves crashing through wooden beams, tearing down walls, and sweeping Karen's empire into the mud. The final straw came one Friday evening when I returned home to find a bright orange notice nailed to my gate, declaring me in violation of multiple HOA ordinances and warning that further refusal to comply would result in the HOA seizing not just fines, but access to the lake itself. And I stood there staring at that paper until the edges curled in the setting sun, and I swore aloud that by the time another notice touched my property, there would be no cabins left to fight over. That night, I prepared for the moment, checking my generator, testing the old crank that released the dam's gates, making sure everything was ready for when I turned the key. And as I stood on the stone platform looking out over the moonlit lake, the water black and endless, I felt a calmness wash over me. A calmness born of certainty, because I knew what I had to do and why I had to do it. And no HOA, no Karen, no false authority could take that truth from me. The next morning, I walked the shoreline where Karen and her investors were celebrating the grand opening of the first set of cabins, their laughter grating in my ears as champagne corks popped and cameras flashed, capturing their smiles against the backdrop of the lake they thought they owned. And when Karen caught my eye across the crowd, she smirked as if to say, "You've lost," and I smiled back, because she had no idea just how wrong she was. No idea that the water she toasted in front of would be the very weapon that erased her triumph overnight. The courtroom was filled with tension as I walked in, the air thick with anticipation, the whispers of onlookers echoing off the walls like the rustling of dry leaves. Everyone knowing this was more than just a dispute over cabins and water rights, it was about greed, arrogance, and the consequences of underestimating the wrong man. And as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, I could see the HOA board members across from me, their faces pale, their expensive suits hanging loose on their slouched shoulders as though the weight of the world had already started to press down on them. Karen at the center, her smugness gone, her lips pressed into a tight line. The queen of the lake reduced to a trembling subject waiting to be judged. And behind her sat the angry families who had bought those 79 cabins. Their dreams now soggy piles of timber and ash-colored mud, their fury misdirected at me when all along it was the HOA that had lied to them, promised them paradise, and instead delivered destruction. The judge, a stern-looking man with deep creases in his forehead, struck his gavel and called the court to order, his voice booming across the silent chamber. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how this played out, the truth was finally going to be laid bare for everyone to see. Because I had fought this battle, not just with water and stone, but with evidence, persistence, and the unshakable conviction that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, was above accountability. My attorney began laying out the case, piece by piece, showing contracts that were never legally binding, permits that were forged, property maps altered to claim ownership over land and water that had always been mine, and photographs of construction trucks trespassing on my shoreline, tearing up soil and choking the life out of the lake I had nurtured for decades. The very same lake my family had built the dam to protect generations ago. And with each document presented, the color drained further from Karen's face, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. And when the prosecutor asked her to respond, she stammered through half-truths and contradictions, her voice cracking under the pressure of her own lies, while the judge watched her with eyes that betrayed no sympathy, only disdain for the reckless arrogance she and her board had displayed. Witness after witness came forward, engineers who testified that the cabins were built on unsafe foundations, county officials admitting under oath that permits were falsified under pressure from HOA influence, and even residents who confessed that they were misled, coerced, or outright bullied into believing the HOA had legal authority over the lake. And as their testimonies piled up, the case against them grew so undeniable that even their own lawyer began to falter, his arguments weak, his words shallow compared to the mountain of truth pressing down on their side of the courtroom. By midday, it was clear the outcome was no longer in question. It was only a matter of how severe the consequences would be. And when the judge finally called a recess, the courtroom erupted into whispers again. Some people looking at me with admiration, others with resentment. But none could deny that the tide had turned and justice was rolling forward with the same unstoppable force that had swept away those cabins just weeks before. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned, his gavel striking sharply against the block as he delivered the verdict, his words slicing through the air like a blade. The HOA was guilty of fraud, trespassing, unlawful construction, environmental damage, and reckless endangerment. Their entire board was stripped of authority, fines in the millions imposed, and their charter dissolved effective immediately. Meaning not only had they lost the cabins, but they no longer even existed as an organization under state law. Their empire wiped off the map just as I had promised. And in that silence that followed, the weight of his words hung heavy, the reality of their downfall settling like ash on their shoulders. Karen collapsed back into her chair, eyes glassy, her voice caught in her throat as though she still couldn't comprehend that her reign was over, while the families who had invested in those cabins turned on her, shouting accusations, demanding restitution, their anger boiling over into chaos. And the bailiffs had to intervene to keep order. But I sat there quietly, calm, watching it unfold with the same satisfaction I had felt when the floodgates opened. Because I knew this wasn't revenge, it was justice. And justice has a way of restoring balance when arrogance tips the scales too far. After court adjourned, reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward me as they asked how it felt to bring down an entire HOA. And I answered simply, telling them that no one should be bullied into submission by people who abuse power. That land, water, and legacy mean more than quick profits, and that communities are meant to be protected, not exploited. My words spreading through the media like ripples across the lake I had reclaimed, inspiring others who had suffered under the grip of corrupt HOAs to stand up and fight back in their own battles. In the weeks that followed, the wreckage of the cabins was cleared away, the shoreline restored, the wildlife slowly returning. And as I stood once more on top of the dam looking out over the water, the sun rising behind the mountains, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you defend what is rightfully yours and protect it from those who seek to destroy it out of greed. And though scars remained on the land and in the memories of those who had lost their investments, the lake itself endured, resilient, strong, and free from the clutches of those who thought they could own it with money and lies. And as I walked back down the slope toward my home, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that the lesson had been delivered loud and clear, that arrogance sinks, greed drowns, but truth and perseverance will always float to the surface, just like my lake, eternal and untamed. Subscribe to Sham Stories YouTube channel for more dramatic tales of justice, revenge, and the power of standing your ground against those who think they can take what is yours.